conventions, let's say, such as using numbers instead of specific letters. We are also concerned with the idea of the NLP substituting a proper ethnographical analysis of the living situation of these people, because we fear the idea of context blindedness. In this case, we have to wonder, why are we asking for these opinions? There's a risk of normalization. It's like we're asking these people to leave an Airbnb review if we do not engage personally, directly, and making a research on the context as a whole. So there's this fear of normalization of their situation. Okay, they said that the camp is not that bad. Okay, let it be. Instead of collecting life stories and all that comes with it. Of course, on the ecological, technological aspect, there is the idea of the carbon footprint of NLP, the carbon footprint of, training the system to account for all the, transliteration issues, so on and so forth. And also the trustworthiness of the system, such as if this person wants to complain, do they fear a sort of like being connected to this judgment? Do they fear retaliation? For people who may come from a dictatorship, yeah, it's not a fear. Okay. There's also the idea, I'm wrapping up, is the last thing, of life in a refugee camp is also perceived as something that is hopefully transitory. We know that in the end, there are people who spend decades of their life there, but their living there is always marked by the hope that it will be transitory. And so we may also fear a low engagement, because once people do something to ameliorate the place, it's like they acknowledge this situation. So sorry for going over.
With the time we do the sort of depth justice. So, but we hope that this is really sort of an exercise to get us in sort of a different headspace. And as you can tell from my report, there's a sort of a second phase to this workshop that we're now parked, but we'll thank you very much. The first time we did this, and I want to have like an extra applause for Bogdana, who's done fantastic work to put this.
To welcome our virtual participants, and we are excited to jump into our panel discussion. And maybe just before we do that, to introduce the workshop for everyone who is joining us virtually, the ecosystemic challenges in AI, like human hybrid artificial intelligence, and maybe just briefly inviting my collaborators to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Paola Ricaurte. I'm a senior Trustworthy Fellow with Mozilla Foundation. And I'll pass it to Roel.
Hi everyone, I'm Roel Dobbe. I'm an assistant professor at Delft University of Technology, where I work at the intersection of engineering, design, and governance of data-driven and algorithmic systems.
And hi everyone, I'm Anna Valdivia. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at King's College London, and I'm analyzing how AI is jeopardizing fundamental rights. Hi everyone, I'm Maria Perez Ortiz. I'm an assistant professor at the AI Center at University College London, and I work mostly at the intersection of AI and sustainability, and recently I'm very interested in bringing these topics to different curriculums. So I just co-lead a new master on AI and sustainability, and we are, for example, I'm trying to understand how to include more topics related to sustainability and climate change to different areas of different curriculums in university spaces.
Great, thank you so much. And then with that, we wanted to share that in the first part of the interactive workshop, we were working on a few different case studies and investigating what could be the impact from when situating the algorithmic system in the socio-ecological technical systems approach. And now we're excited to hear from experts about some of these ecosystemic challenges, and I'll pass it to our first speaker.
Yes, so we have a fabulous panel, which will be a hybrid panel. So one speaker here in the room, here in Amsterdam, and I think 2 speakers online, right? Is Linda also online? Yeah. We'll start. They will give a short talk, and then afterwards we'll have a discussion. And we're starting with Becky Kazensky. Becky, welcome. Becky Kazensky is a scholar and practitioner focused on advancing data justice. She's the research lead at the Engine Room, overseeing research across the organization and leading a project exploring intersections between digital rights and climate and environmental justice. There's a report that's about to come out, right?
Just a couple of weeks.
Just a couple of weeks. So we are getting sort of a hot sort of take and early view into the conclusions and implications of that research. Becky holds a PhD in media studies and political science from the University of Amsterdam, where she's also currently a visiting researcher. Becky, thank you very much. We have your slides here on the PC. Put it on full screen mode. It should be also shared in online. And if you, in order for the online audience to hear you well, just try to project your voice a little bit so that the microphone.
Just fine.
Yeah, fix it up. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Second. All right. Hi everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers for having me today. So as already introduced so kindly, my name is Becky, and I come from an organization called the Engine Room. It's a civil society organization which works directly with a number of different social justice and human rights groups around the world to think about data and technology and how it enters into social change work to try to make the world a better place. And sometimes how technology does or doesn't fit into that easily. And today, I guess my kind of primer for coming here today was to share a bit of findings from this research that we finished up recently and will be releasing at the end of June in a public report. And in this research, we started from the point of exploring what intersections, what cross-cutting areas already exist between technology and digital rights centered work within civil society and movements and questions of climate and environmental justice. And we've been working on this project together with an anthropologist named Paola Ricaurte, whose specialization has been looking at land rights in India and how that is protected and kind of people's struggles with extractive companies that are kind of coming in and encroaching land. And yeah, so, you know, coming today, obviously the focus is on AI. Our focus was a bit broader. We were looking at technology or digital technology and digital rights. You might be wondering, what exactly is digital rights? Digital rights is one of these words that can mean a lot of different things. It refers to work that is trying to bring technology work into alignment with social justice and human rights. Sometimes people talk about it in terms of public interest technology. Maybe you've heard this term recently. Or obviously AI ethics is going to be something we've come across. So a lot of AI ethicists feed into digital rights discussions as well. And there's really lots of work there. So the scope is broad. And of course, climate and environmental justice. These are two histories and movements that have changed a lot over decades. And so in trying to understand where all this kind of work meets,
the goal was really coming from this impetus within the digital rights space. There's so many people right now who have an appetite to understand what their role is in responding to the many unfolding crises that we face at a societal scale. So I work on technology issues, but clearly technology is part of a broader context. So what is my responsibility and what actually can I do in response to the ecological and climate crises? So yeah, by exploring these intersections, the hope is that the digital rights space can better support the climate movement, better support environmental justice movements. And in so doing, AI is definitely a part of that features quite largely. So I'm going to contextualize AI in relation to some of our main findings, which were focused more on tech more broadly. So just to give you an idea in this research project of who we spoke to, it was really a diverse group of people in terms of the region of the world that they're based in, and what the focus of their work is. And so we did a number of different interviews. This was qualitative research that we did, and it comprised interviews, it comprised a number of different discussions with practitioners, and also part of this project was focused on helping digital rights funders understand how to support these different parts of civil society better. So we also spoke to a lot of funders. And just to give you an idea of the variety of different work that people do, we spoke to a algorithmic disinformation expert who focuses on climate disinformation. We spoke to a researcher who looks at how AI is being used in precision agriculture and how this kind of contributes to extractive, unsustainable farming practices. We talked to technologists who are trying to make the internet more sustainable by or carbon neutral. This can mean many different things. We spoke to, from the environmental side, divestment campaigners who are, so the divestment movement is trying to get large institutions to pull their money out of fossil fuel companies. And they're doing really important work. The Netherlands has a really active divestment movement that has achieved a lot in the last year, especially. So this is to give you an idea of how many different kinds of intersections there actually are. You might be wondering, what does the divestment movement care about technology or digital rights? And I think one of the big connections that comes up immediately is around security and safety, because often people are working with movements on the ground where their work is really not wanted. And so they really have to think a lot about their digital security or their cybersecurity. So this actually was like one of the biggest bridges we saw between movements, and one of the existing collaborations we see between technology and climate and environment. And in our research, we came across a number of cross-cutting themes, which carried across our discussions with people. And one of these was around the question of growth. So we heard from a lot of people, both on the environmental and digital rights side, that our current economic models are simply unsustainable because they're premised on continued expansion. And that does relate to technology and AI, because these technologies fit within particular kinds of business models, sit in particular kinds of corporate contexts, and therefore the way that they're applied often may, serve this kind of continued expansion perspective. And another is that another cross-cutting theme is that extractive dynamics cut across tech sector and environmental climate sector. What do I mean by extractive? In the context of climate and environment, we think about, and I think Anna already spoke about this a bit, extractive practices of mineral mining, excavation, and what this does to land and to communities. And on the digital rights and tech side, the way people are talking about what extractive means these days is thinking about the way data is used about us, where we often don't necessarily have much control or say in the way that data is used, the way that it ends up in in AI language learning models, and in surveillance, as it might also be discussed. Surveillance is considered to be kind of an extractive way of thinking about people's data. So this is kind of a big unifying theme, and it just comes up all the time. And just one more that I'll mention for now is that in the face of these kind of extractive dynamics and unsustainable growth, it's essential to think about alternative models. And what might those look like? How might we build a commons, something that we share together that's not an extractive form of collecting data or using data about us? So that's the big question there. And one area we looked at a lot in terms of what's been happening with developments recently around sustainability is a lot of different kinds of internet focused and digital tech focused initiatives that are trying to create this carbon neutral, zero carbon internet. And this is an interesting place to look at because you actually see a lot of development and a lot of movement towards thinking about sustainability, ecological questions. But one thing we observe a lot is that even though people will talk about carbon neutral or zero carbon, there's very little agreement about what it actually means to become sustainable. And so if we look at a lot of big tech companies that absolutely do now have sustainability plans, it seems like a very important development. But a lot of these sustainability plans rely on this idea that we can use carbon. We just need to kind of move around where it comes from and where it goes. And I'm talking about carbon offsets, for example, where we can use the carbon now, but if we plant a tree somewhere, that kind of takes care of the environmental impact. And the people we spoke to from civil society really pushed us as a sector to challenge this idea that it's as simple as simply burn the carbon, plant a tree, and that kind of, fixes the problem. So I think there's really a lot to unpack there, and I think it speaks to the need for kind of a broader framing of what we mean by ecological and ecosystemic framings around technology. What kind of is it beyond simply offsetting our carbon, basically? And the good news, I would say, is that there's already so much happening there that I think people working on technology can do more to support with. And that includes pushing for greater transparency in big tech companies and challenging some of the kinds of sustainability plans that we see coming out now. Also fostering greater solidarity with the many different kinds of social justice groups that are already pushing for a social justice centric lens on technology. One example is Amazon employees for climate and the organizing they do to try to challenge Amazon as a company to do better and really live up to the big promises and goals that they've set out. And there's so many more other opportunities here to explore. My time is coming up now. So I'm gonna end my presentation here with a couple of provocations. One is that in thinking about what AI and ecological or ecosystemic lenses on AI might be, I think it's important to think not just about carbon intensiveness. And here I'm responding to a lot of conversations I hear these days about we want to measure carbon, we want to find out where the carbon inefficiencies are, we want to stamp them out, we want to make things as efficient as possible. That is very important, but it's one part of the puzzle. And we really want to actually come to an agreement on what it means to become a carbon neutral. And the second is that we want to understand ecosystemic concerns around AI as part of broader concerns around extractivism and extractive dynamics across the tech sector and other industries that work in collaboration with the tech sector. So I'm going to leave you with that, and I look forward to discussing this more.
Thank you, Becky. We'll move to the second speaker, take a break. Let's see. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen from here. Oops. From here. This one. Yes. And now, Tega, are you there?
Yeah, hi everyone.
Hi, Tega. Hi. Let's see if we can bring up your screen. Do you have the ability to share your screen?
Yeah, let me just get that set up. So I'm going to flip this. And I'm going to share this one.
Excellent. Yes.
Okay, so you see that. What happened to my
Looks like a background of sorts. Yeah, you're in Keynote. So that should work. Yeah.
Here we go.
All right. Okay, let me, it's great to see you again, Tega. Let me introduce you to the community. Tega Brain is an artist, environmental engineer, and researcher whose work intersects art, ecology, and engineering. As an artist, she makes dysfunctional devices, eccentric infrastructures, and experimental information systems. She's an assistant professor at the State University of New York and holds degrees in environmental engineering and fine arts. Her current research addresses the relationship between computational systems and the environment. Tega, welcome, and take it away.
Okay, sorry, I just lost that, but I think you have it back now. You see my slide. Fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really nice to be here and see these talks. Yeah, I am an artist, and for the last few years, I also have a background in environmental engineering, so my work is very much about the way that infrastructures structure our relationship to environment and ecology. And for the last few years, I've done a series of works that I've really been focusing on the way that AI is shifting the way shifting ecological imaginaries, so how we imagine we can live together, and also imaginaries for the role that technology is going to play in the climate crisis and the ecological crises we are facing this century. So today I'm going to share two recent works that probe this question in different ways. The first is a project called Synthetic Messenger, and this is a collaboration with Sam Levine, who's also a New York-based artist, and we do a lot of work together. And this project responds to the way that digital advertising and the media have been profoundly shaped by AI systems and algorithmic systems. Just last summer, when we were working on this project, it launched in 2021, Manhattan looked like this. So, this was a blanket of smoke that was covering the North American continent all the way from the West Coast fires. And you would walk around in the street and it would literally smell like something was on fire, despite the fact it was from the other side of the country. Around the same time, this was an infographic that was sort of being shared on social media just around the amount of climate coverage that was being dedicated, the amount of media coverage that was dedicated to climate versus Bezos's space launch in 2020. So you can see, given the gravity of the climate issue, climate news is still failing to get the attention it deserves in news and headlines. I think it's also worth thinking about the way that you know, we are dealing with this crisis in, you know, in a context of sort of post-truth politics. And, you know, this is a quote that is from Bram Buscher, and his book that he recently wrote about the role of platform capitalism in environmentalism. And he says, you know, we now live in a world where commitment to any shared understanding of reality or facts seems unrealistic. My reality competes with your reality, and alternative facts compete with actual facts. As long as one's reality or facts gets traction or generate commercial success, they may seem legitimate in global information markets. And so I think the question then is, you know, what is the impact for climate response and for, you know, science at large, right? This is the media environment we are working in. And this media environment is profoundly shaped by the business model of the internet, which relies on selling ads that run alongside stories. So the more traffic a story receives, the more money it earns. And then there's this incentive to optimize news coverage and journalism for clicks and views, signals that are assumed to indicate engagement and the online crowd. So engagement data then also determines how stories are aggregated. So if they get a lot of traffic, then they are listed in different places, in more places around the internet. So, you know, signals like URL pings, mouse clicks, scrolls now determine the value of news reporting. Sorry, I need to go back. And they are shaping how we understand these sort of existential issues. So Synthetic Messenger is a project that's diving into this, this mess. It takes the form of a botnet. You know, as you all know, you know, a bot is an algorithmic process that is programmed to automatically carry out online activities, often simulating human interactions. And so we created a botnet of 100 of these bots. And the goal of our botnet is to artificially inflate the value of certain climate news stories. So every day our system searches the internet for recent news coverage of the climate crisis. It's looking for keywords such as climate, global warming, climate change, and then it clicks on all the ads that are running alongside these news stories. So in the ad industry, this is called click fraud or inauthentic behavior. But, you know, I think it's also worth asking, like, what is an authentic click, right? Like next time you click on something, you know, are you being authentic? Like, I think that is a weird phrase. You know, we click on content for lots of different reasons. And so our botnet is driving traffic, synthetic traffic, to climate reporting. And in doing so, it's amplifying this news and thereby making this content more lucrative for media outlets by generating advertising revenue. Clicking on ads increases the value of the article, and it also changes the hierarchy of an aggregation of articles across the web. So this project, you know, it's basically building one automated system to talk to another, bots talking to bots. And as our system draws more attention to the climate crisis, it also reveals the way that these logics are radically changing the production and consumption of media and shaping the narratives through which we understand the climate. So we presented this work at the STRP festival in Eindhoven last year in the Netherlands, actually, so just nearby. And we presented it as this online performance. So we presented it in a Zoom call. The Zoom call ran for like 2 weeks. You could join the Zoom call and you could hang out with all of our bots doing their, you know, their news clicking activities. This is what the Zoom call looked like.
Click.
It was lockdown, it was COVID, so we obviously developed the project to be presented in this online format.
Scroll. Click. Scroll. Click.
Can you hear the sound, by the way?
Scroll.
I hope so.
Scroll. Click.
Okay, you get the idea. Okay, so it's this sort of very surreal, I guess, algorithmic performance. On the website, you know, the stats of all the bots' activities are logged. The botnet over 2 weeks resulted in visiting 2 million sites and clicking on over 6 million ads. We also do blacklist a number of sites such as Murdoch Media, or sites that we know that are climate deniers or, supportive of the fossil fuel industry. But the work basically positions media as a crucial space for shaping climate narratives. It's, those who control the media sort of have an outsized influence on the carbon cycle, which is what our, beautiful system diagram on the screen is trying to convey. And of course, the fossil fuel industry has known this for a long time, right? For a long time, they have, engaged in very sophisticated media manipulation strategies, because they know if you control the media cycle, you can control the carbon cycle. And there's lots of examples of this, right? Bots and trolls spreading false information during climate emergencies, such as the 2019 Australian fires. But we've also recently seen how platforms like Twitter and Facebook are willing to flag misinformation relating to vaccines, and yet not willing to do the same thing for climate misinformation. This is obviously changing, but still the efforts of platforms like Twitter and Facebook to moderate climate misinformation are, tiny compared to the scale of the problem. It's really not being addressed. The other thing is, that it's still perfectly legal for the fossil fuel industry to, advertise on these platforms, but climate activist groups are not allowed to, because it's seen as political advertising. So, these social media platforms are very much supporting the status quo and supporting climate's deception and climate denial, right? And, if we want to adequately address the climate crisis, we have to consider platform reform, and we have to really reconsider the role of, AI and algorithms in our media systems. The climate crisis is a communications crisis at this point. So that's one engagement. The second project I will just quickly share as well is a similar project, right? It's also exploring this question of like media and automation. However, it's rather than sort of intervening or subverting existing platforms, this project is sort of envisaging an alternative sort of digital network. The project's called Solar Protocol, and it is really like exploring how decisions of ecological governance are made. And it's exploring how these decisions might be made in alternative ways than just through AI or ML, which is, obviously where our imagination is with automation. So Solar Protocol is a planetary scale network. That is supposed to be an animation, but it's obviously not really working. Okay, I'll keep going. Solar Protocol is a planetary scale network of solar powered web servers, each stewarded by a volunteer around the world. So a solar powered web server looks like this. It's just a very small computer that is powered by a small solar system. And each of our servers runs custom software. So you can see one on the screen here. And we have set them up in lots of different locations around the world. It's a web server, so it's connected to the internet. It's using internet infrastructure. But our servers check in with each other, and they collectively serve the web platform that you can find at solarprotocol.net. But they serve it from whichever server has the most sunshine at the time. So network traffic is directed to wherever there is the sunniest location in the network, and that's where the website comes from at the time. So it changes throughout the day. And so Solar Protocol is relying on the sun and the sun's cycle as a form of what we are calling like natural intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. We are using a planetary dynamic to program and automate how our network operates. The project's grown from sort of a small scale prototype, and we now have servers in about 8 locations across the world. Obviously having them in different time zones makes the network more resilient, because then you have like more sunshine basically. But basically the network is working with the DNS protocol, where, DNS is the decentralized system that connects the URL address of a server, so the number that tells your browser where the server is located, And it connects the URL to that IP address. So it tells your browser like where on the internet to find the website you're looking for. And, in large scale, high volume web services, like, imagine Google, for example, the DNS protocol would be set up so that when your browser is like doing a Google search, the DNS protocol usually would send your request to whichever server, whichever data center of theirs is giving your browser the quickest response time, right? So it's like, you're in Amsterdam, it will send you to probably a European-based data center. And so their protocol typically is optimized for speed, right? To give the user the quickest response. But, it doesn't have to be like that, right? We don't have to optimize for speed necessarily. And in Solar Protocol, we don't, right? In Solar Protocol, we are instead, decisions about where to move computational work and where to move traffic is based on where the most naturally available energy is, rather than according to what would produce the quickest results for the user. And so, so the distribution of sunshine is determining how resources are used in the network. Because of course, wherever you're directing web traffic is wherever the computational work is happening, right? To generate the website, to send the website out to your computer and so on. So it is this way of automating resource management using a natural, like, planetary dynamic. And so it is this also rumination on AI, right? The history of AI has been characterized by a changing definition of what is intelligence. Historian Stephanie Dick has written on this, on the way that 20th century AI was built around this idea of human intelligence, and that the goal was to sort of simulate human reasoning. Of course, 21st century AI is ML, right? It's machine learning. It's not about simulating human reasoning, it's about using data-driven statistical methods. What we see in this history is that the definition of intelligence is constantly changing. And so we want to provoke here another way of thinking about intelligence, where we're using like environmental logics and looking to the environment as a model of intelligence, right? We're letting our environment have agency in the systems we're designing. It's a prompt to design in concert with our environment rather than sort of ignoring it, which is the way we make a lot of infrastructure. So the website looks like this. This graphic sort of shows you the way that the routing is changing. Each ring of this graphic is a server. It's the last 72 hours of server data. The yellow is showing you the sunlight at each server, and the colored bars are showing you when that server was the active server. So when that server was, sending out the project. And so basically the platform is sort of like a distributed solar powered virtual artist space. So that's how we're thinking about it, right? It offers server space to all of our server stewards, and we're gradually hosting more websites on it. So a couple of websites we're hosting at the moment are Extinction Rebellion Solarpunk Storytelling Contest, and the website for the Low Carbon Research Methods group in Trent University, where we also host a server. I've talked about this visualization, and as part of the project, we're also building this API where you can access all the solar data from each server as a way of opening the project up so that we can continue to sort of experiment and invite people to explore this kind of planetary logic in our network. I guess the only other thing to note is, when you visit the website, this sort of panel on the left has information about the server you are speaking to, right? So we try to put information about the specific server, like who's hosting it, where it's coming from, what the energy status of that server is, to really try to situate the website, right? And speak to the way that, the cloud isn't just coming from nowhere, right? It's very like material, it's very of a place. So we're trying to put that on the sort of front end of the platform. I could say more, but I think I'm at time, so I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vega. Fascinating. let's go to our last speaker. Hi, Lina. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank
Hi.
you.
So, are you using slides as well?
Pardon me? Oh, I am not. No,
You're not using slides. Okay.
I'm not.
But then I'll introduce you. So Lina Konstantinovici is the founder and CEO of Innovation 4.4, an organization focused on accelerating innovation needed to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, with 3 ocean-focused initiatives: an Oceans Prize, an Oceans Funders Knowledge Platform, and ocean technology showcases for governments and corporations. Lina has spent the past 15 years building impact solutions as an innovator, entrepreneur, investor, family office, and sustainability advisor. And Lina has evaluated over 6,000 technologies, advised several hundred startups, and co-founded several of them. Lina, thank you for joining us, and yeah, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Bobby, for inviting me to this very important conversation. It's a delight to be here, and I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person. I've been traveling, meeting with several governments around implementing some of these solutions. So I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you in person. And I also apologize if there are any delays or connectivity issues. There's a huge storm here in Bucharest where I am today, so I apologize in advance for that. So I'll start my remarks by saying, as you've heard in the previous presentation, often when we speak about sustainability and AI, there's an awareness of the energy intensity that AI requires, and therefore a question of how do we meet those energy needs in a clean, sustainable, and economically viable way. And I'll mention just a couple of data points to underscore this. When training an AI model in natural language, natural language processing, that process produces the equivalent of 5 times the emissions of the lifetime of an American car, or 300 airplane trips from New York to San Francisco. So it is a viable concern, and solutions like the one you've just seen presented are needed to meet that demand and ensure that we have a zero emissions way of meeting these needs. One of the technologies that are in our portfolio that we're working with several governments on the energy side is a liquid compressed air technology, energy generation technology that presents the lowest cost per kilowatt hour and also is a zero emissions technology. But I'd like to broaden the scope of our discussion, and there have been some great examples of opportunities to make AI more sustainable or apply AI to solving sustainability challenges. Humans build solutions in silos of expertise, which often produces undesirable, unintended consequences. AI is likely to replicate and deepen the reductionism in our problem solving unless we intentionally build, excuse me, unless we intentionally build systems, a systems thinking approach into the AI's ability to synthesize a solution. One that takes into account lateral expertise relevant to the subject matter being processed, minimizing the unintended consequences. I'll give an example of what I mean by that. For example, in looking at the plastics issue, plastics are typically understood as a waste issue. They're in our oceans, they're in our landfills, they're in our rivers. it's easy to understand the waste component. However, plastics are also a toxicity issue that impacts human health, ecosystem health, and so on. So if we only have waste experts at the table trying to solve the issue, we end up with unfortunate examples that we see many of, like, for example, building homes out of plastic waste. Very well intended to use a material that is plentiful to build much needed housing for many around the world who are underhoused. However, if that house gives somebody cancer, asthma, dementia, Alzheimer's, all the known effects of exposure to the endocrine disrupting chemicals, the plasticizers that are in plastic, if those aren't taken into account, then we have unfortunate, while well-intended, attempts to solve for that issue. And so my invitation or provocation is to think about how do we apply a systems thinking approach with sufficient lateral expertise to actually inform the synthesis of information towards building a solution so that we can minimize the unintended consequences that such processes often produce. And we have many, many examples. The plastic swan is just one of them. And so, and conversation from the thinking aspect. How do we build AI algorithms? So I'll leave it at that and invite questions and conversation.
Thank you, Lina. The punchline was you dropped just for a little bit, but it was just for a few seconds. So, but I think the message came across, right? Okay, great. So let me bring Vega back. Lina
is being recorded.
Lina's still here? Yeah. Ah, here you are.
I am. I just dropped off for a second. I'm back.
Probably. Can I pin multiple people? No.
I guess so.
Sorry?
Andy.
Okay.
I was going to do that, but yeah, if you jump into
Yeah. Okay. Well, now we have both on the screen here, a bit smaller, but that should work for now. Thank you all very much, all three speakers, Becky, Tega, and Lina. To sort of link back the discussions to this community, I wanted to just briefly touch upon a couple of points we made earlier on as we started this conversation this afternoon. And we started off with the like kind of looking back at history and another moment in time where we saw the rapid introduction of computer systems in the workplace. And this was inspired by the work of Joan Greenbaum, who wrote a book, Design at Work, Cooperative Design of Computer Systems. And in that, she basically, in the early 90s, together with Morten Thiem, by the way, they, in the early 90s, they sort of point at the ways in which a lot of the scholarship that was looking at integrating and sort of user-related issues with computer systems try to address these user issues towards sort of integrating the user into the system development process. And they drew the conclusion that we often fail, or sort of we fail more often because we solve the wrong problem than because we get the wrong solution to the right problem. And in this community that they back then started up, they said we're trying to realistically appraise the way we work with a clearer understanding of the politics of, in this case, the workplace, and a careful eye on the assumptions we bring with us. And so to pick up on that last bit, so the assumptions, I want to sort of invite you, you've already touched upon it, but what are the kinds of assumptions that you feel are prevalent in development of AI systems that you've seen, that you've come across, or perhaps that you've discussed with your, for Becky, for instance, you've discussed with people in your study, and what are the kinds of assumptions, and what can we sort of, in what ways can we have you yourself sort of reflect on assumptions, like how those assumptions shape your understanding of problems and working towards the right solutions. So, Becky, would you?
Sure. So the question is, what kind of assumptions have I observed to be prevalent in the design of AI systems?
And maybe to sort of
Yeah.
expand on the point you made at the end, where you said, well, looking at carbon footprint might actually, it's relevant, but it might actually be less relevant than sort of other aspects of systemic issues that you saw.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think my point around carbon intensiveness was not that it isn't important, but that it's a narrow lens on the problem sometimes. So if we're trying to solve for climate justice and environmental justice, carbon, so kind of just trying to get a more efficient system, or trying to get that system to use less carbon, isn't always necessarily going to get you to a climate justice aligned solution. So I think that was kind of my main point there. And in terms of how you do align decarbonization with climate justice and environmental justice, I think what I've alluded to in focusing on these connections between different movements and communities is thinking about the really crucial work that is happening by people to challenge extractive business models of Amazon, for example, or other big tech companies, trying to create a labor solidarity so that people who work for AI companies and tech companies aren't exploited. And so when you think about your environmental and climate goals in relation to these kinds of human rights and social justice issues, I think when you come back to carbon and carbon intensiveness, maybe one question that arises is, okay, so this company has pledged to become sustainable by the year 2030, or maybe they're already using a lot of renewable energy. But for example, one question would be, where is that renewable energy coming from? Because you hear a lot about enormous new construction of data centers in places where water is scarce, where people are already having electricity issues, and where perhaps some new renewable energy infrastructure was finally built. The community thought that they were going to get to use it for their housing, because housing is where a lot of energy goes, right? Instead, it gets diverted to this new data center, and the data center is going to be used to power an extractive data business model. So this would be kind of a way of thinking about carbon intensiveness that's also getting at larger questions around extraction and social justice. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to, if I may, just build on the carbon markets, carbon offsets comments. There's another aspect of it which often isn't addressed as much as it deserves, which is the timeline question. If the carbon markets plan and offsets timeline is on a 50, 100-year timeline, if the markets are intended to work on a long-term basis to produce the reductions, are they aligned with the timeline that we actually have in order to address our carbon surplus? And that is a really important question, because if our plan is on a timeline that's irrelevant, i.e. it will be too late to really address the changes that need to be made on that longer timeline, then that's really less useful way of ensuring that we get to where we're going if we miss the timeline that we have to do so. So the timeline question is an important one, whether it comes to various types of innovations or carbon offsets. The timeline has to be aligned, and as we've been seeing in each and every IPCC report, the news is always worse than thought.
Ina, you still there?
From
We have ecosystemic challenges.
Yes. we do.
previous reports. So the timeline question is really key when solutions proposed to get to those outcomes. I apologize. We've just gotten an emergency alert to the storm is getting worse, so apologies again.
Yes, yeah, we've got most of your contribution here, so thank you. Vega,
Hopefully some of that came through.
yes, it did. Vega. Oh, you're muted still.
Okay, great. I mean, there's so many assumptions that these technologies are being mobilized with in the environment space. I think there still is this prevailing idea that they somehow give you a more objective view of the world, right? That a data-driven perspective, because of the massiveness of these data sets, is going to be more objective than sort of ethnographic methods or these other knowledge practices that exist, right? And so I think that's always the first thing to question is what's left out, and in what ways do they encourage us to value knowledge in different ways, right? So if I put like a flood sensor network across New York City, which is a project happening at NYU, that data suddenly becomes more authoritative than the folks who have been reporting flooding on 311 for years, right? I think the next thing is still that there's this dream that these technologies are going to depoliticize decision making, and so I see a lot of this argument being made in conversations around planetary computing, around the automation of decisions. There is this ongoing idea for, with computing in general, that it's going to help us depoliticize decision making, and we just know that this is not the case. I mean, look at the way that COVID responses has been so political, right? You think that a vaccine would be a fairly straightforward thing to roll out in terms of normative health stuff, and it just has not been like that in the US or Australia or the context I'm familiar with. So the idea that we have fantastic high resolution, digital twin AI models showing us something about our environment does not mean that decision-making becomes easier or less political. And then I think the other thing to really think about is this carbon neutrality question, to build on this question of carbon neutrality offsets. This is a huge computational challenge, right? I don't think it's surprising that companies like Microsoft, Google, the big tech giants are, promoting carbon neutrality and that discourse as hard as they are, because how do we know when things are carbon neutral? It's a massive computational undertaking, and carbon neutral policy means that there's a huge role for the technology sector in managing that, right? It's a huge problem. It's really difficult, but it means the expansion of computing, and it puts those tech companies squarely in the center of climate change response. So I think we also need to be very suspicious of that, especially when you have a company like Microsoft, for example, who, if you go to their website, they're all about how carbon negative they are. They're going to offset all of their emissions since the 70s, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, they are have a lot of fossil fuel contracts. They are using all of their AI technologies to help mining companies in Australia and the US, all around the world, deal with geospatial data, find the oil that's still in the ground so that we can get it out as fast as possible. So it's complete greenwashing. And on one hand, they're doing this, neutrality talk, lining them up for the future. And on the other hand, they're helping the oil industry extract stuff as fast as possible with AI. So again, we have this problem, right? That the technology is in no way solution or a problem solver. It is, you know, deployed and going to make whatever context it's dropped into more efficient. And if that's extraction, it's going to like bring its efficiencies and its insight to that context. So yeah.
Thank you. I have one more question, but in the meantime, we will have more time for questions from the audience. And I think even if you're in the live stream as well, I think you're watching it, right? So if you're on the live stream, you can also type your question underneath, right, in the commentary. So I have one more question before I hand over. So we just looked at, okay, where are we and what are the sort of the typical assumptions in the sort of AI scholarship space, but also in the industry. The other thing we explored this afternoon was how systems thinking, and in particular, we looked at social, ecological, technical systems as a frame to uncover different kinds of couplings between the social, the ecological, and the technical. And I think all of you have a relationship to systems thinking. I know that Tega, you even also wrote a piece that's sort of dealing with our understanding what are the limits of thinking in terms of ecosystems. So yeah, I'd like to sort of ask you the question to share how has systems thinking helped your work? How would you sort of recommend, also particularly young scholars who are in particular fields, to sort of adopt a broader sort of systems lens? Yeah, and any other advice you have on integrating such dimensions into our work as scholars, but also more broadly as human beings. Would anyone like to go first?
Sure.
Lina? Yeah.
Hopefully it's coming in. I think the storm has died down a bit. One of the useful frames for systems thinking is natural systems, nature. So our organization is called Innovation 4.4, which stands for innovation aligned with 4.4 billion years of our planetary systems. So looking at natural systems and aligning with natural systems reduces the friction that's caused when we build systems that are not aligned with nature, that go against nature. And so biomimicry or biomimetics, there are several different words for it, basically learning from nature, looking at nature to mimic nature at the ecosystem level, the form level, and the process level, can produce really interesting opportunities to build solutions that are aligned with nature. So looking at those concepts and looking at how nature builds solutions. And sorry, I think another alert, apologies. Looking at nature in terms of how systems and processes can be useful frame.
Thank you, Lina. I think it's dropping again, but I think you were at the end of your answer. Tega.
Yeah, I mean, oh, Lina, are you back?
Still here? You're back.
That's all right. I'm not sure how much came through, but apologies again for the technical difficulties. Basically, just encouraging those who are not familiar with the concept of biomimicry or biomimetics, learning from nature, to look at models in nature for process design and ecosystem design.
Thank you. Tega?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wrote a piece on this question of like, the piece was called "The Environment is Not a System," and it was very much motivated by, again, this question of thinking about like what the impacts of AI are, but also that how, you know, a lot of efforts to model or build an understanding of environments rest on this history of ecology, right? Which is very, you know, ecology is very entwined with history of technology as well, right? The idea that we think of is you know, a decision that's being made, right? It's like something that I felt like was taken for granted, and I wanted to really think about what what thinking about an ecosystem means, right? It means you starting to think about like the way that a complex environment is in relation. It does sort of produce an imagination for steering and engineering, right? It's a history that is very linked with cybernetics and, those kind of 20th century ideas. So I'm also really interested in the way that, we use technologies to think environment, right? Whether that's through metaphor or like these kinds of framings. And I think it's always worth just remembering that that is a construction, right? Like we thinking about an ecology as an assemblage, for example, like drawing on terminology more from like the humanities, makes you think about it very differently. And there's sort of assumptions there around like what's knowable, what's not knowable. And also the sort of agency or the weight one gives to sort of other species or other non-human kind of parts of the environments, sort of shifts away from, again, a sort of engineering lens. So I think, being cogent of that is really generative, especially for me. And I'm often in my work trying to take technology metaphors, apply them to environments, but also take environmental metaphors, as you can see in the Solar Protocol project, take environmental logics and apply them to technology, right? So what if we do try to let the environment be an actor in how we're designing our infrastructures, right? I think that's a really interesting question. So, yeah.
Thank you. Do you have any?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. I think I agree a lot on what was just said in terms of I think sometimes I'm a little bit skeptical. I see the importance of and the use of systems thinking, but I think I just, in my research, I've looked a lot at the cybernetic history around thinking of nature as a system and how that's often like focused in the end on control and the idea that you can ultimately control nature and control people in the same way. So I think that's kind of where my hesitancy sometimes comes from, and maybe it's something just to be conscious of when we talk about systems thinking, even as it is super useful and constructive. So it's this kind of question of control. I think one way that it is useful, just to bring it back to, or the way systems thinking is useful, bringing it back to what I discussed with like carbon intensiveness and what does it mean to become carbon neutral. I think my hope is that with systems thinking, it enables us to understand that what we do in our backyard also affects what happens in other places. And with systems like carbon credits, carbon offsets, or renewable energy credits, for example, which tech companies love, this is an example where you're taking a problem and removing it from your backyard, but putting it somewhere else. And so I would hope that systems thinkers would recognize that this is a dynamic that's happening and try to challenge that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, all three. We do have, time for a couple more questions. So anyone? Questions in the audience? Yeah.
So a lot of times the claims made by big companies end up with ethics washing, where they say they have an ethical framework and they're doing good. I think Google's motto is do no evil or something like that. But ultimately, if you look at the impact that their servers are having on the world, so the most usage of the resources is by these big tech companies, and the effect is seen on the underdeveloped countries. So if you look, I think there's a map that shows where the effect of this global warming and server usage is seen. So is there a way to overcome this kind of an issue, or what can we do to try to change this?
Did you hear the question online as well? Yeah.
The question is, yeah. Maybe you could repeat it just so that we.
Yeah. So the question was related to how, especially the infrastructure, computational infrastructure of big tech companies has impacts also in let's say the global south, right? The more the global south. And what are your insights in sort of how to address, overcome those impacts? Are there any insights from your angle of how to deal with that?
And we can combine with Simona's question.
If I understood the question correctly, the essence of the question was about how do you use AI to prevent the greenwashing and ethics washing that large companies are engaging in that ultimately have an impact on the global south?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it could be AI, but more broadly. So that's the first question. What we will do is we'll combine it with another question to be a bit more efficient towards the end of this the panel. I see Simona is also here in the Zoom call. Hi, Simona. Hi, are you still muted? Oh, there you are. So Simona is coming in from Brussels, and she works for one of a member of the European Parliament, Kim van Sparretak, and so she's been listening in. You have another question.
Yes, I was triggered by something that Tega mentioned about AI having this, and big data having this idea of super objectivity, that the moment data is used or AI is used for something, nobody questions the outcomes anymore because obviously it's objective and it solves everything. This is what I see in my work in the Parliament, is such a persistent frame that we even see throughout the lawmaking process on the AI Act that we're working on at the moment. It's a tough one that I've been struggling with for a long time, but I'll give you a go. What can we do to tackle this super dominant frame? Because it's what we notice now is that even when we try and even mention the impact on the environment, the impact on fundamental rights and people, the first reaction you often get is kind of oh, you must be really anti-technology and anti-progression and innovation if you are so negative about technology.
Thank you, Simona. So 2 questions. Who wants to go first? Shall I give it to you, Tega?
Yeah, I can jump in. I'm not on mute. Great. I think it's a real challenge, right? Because you know, it also is sort of entwined with, like, you know, science and data-driven decision making, and like these things obviously have a lot of authority. One argument that I think is you know, has potential is a lot of the challenges we face aren't challenges of needing more data, right? Like, we have IPCC reports, we have like the most signed documents like in history from the scientific community telling us what we need to do, which is stop burning fossil fuels, right? Very simple. And so we can build all the models in the world, but to me, it also, that just, I think what's happening is also that is used as this strategy to say, look, I'm doing something that's politically palatable, right? But that isn't actually doing the thing we need to do. It's this big procrastination tactic of building the model rather than actually just like shutting down the industry. And I see this too, like I'm in an engineering school in NYU, we're doing this big project on flood sensing with the city of New York. Rather than building flood infrastructure or dealing with climate issues, we are building a flood sensor network, right? Because it was the thing that everyone was happy with, right? So there's a political dimension here where that is the palatable solution that makes you look like you're acting, even though you're not actually changing the underlying conditions at all, right? We're just going to measure the emergency and make beautiful visualizations of it. So I don't have a easy solution for you, but I think pointing out that that you know, the availability of the data and the models, that is actually not the challenge. Like, we have that really well established already, even though, yeah, we can always make them higher resolution, but like at what cost? So I that's the sort of framing I'm thinking about. Yeah, but it's a huge challenge.
Thanks. We have a couple minutes. I think we can go over a couple of minutes. So do you have some sort of quick final responses to,
Sure.
to the questions, Becky?
Yeah, sure. So I think for the first question, very fast answer is that there simply, as a starting point, has to be more transparency around what the tech industry currently does and what its effects and impacts are. And so in EU Parliament, EU Greens have been doing really interesting work with adopting the life cycle analysis to understanding the impacts of technology, and they're really looking at the impacts starting from the point at which the ground gets mined and the workers there deal with particular mining conditions, up to the point that the consumer is discarding the device. So I think yeah, more transparency and more regulation, because currently companies aren't actually required to disclose how they implement sustainability plans. And then just the second question, I think I would be tempted to respond to this person who says, oh, you're just against innovation and you don't want nice things. I would say no, we're not against innovation. It will actually take a lot of innovation to change our society from what it is right now. But it's a matter of what do we mean by innovation and who gets to do it. And we should be more creative about that. So yeah.
Thank you. Hopefully that's inspiring, Simona. Lina, any final thoughts?
Sure, I'd like to.
Oh no, I think we lost Lina. Let's see. Yeah, we lost her. So let's give her just a little bit. Well, let me do the thank you word, because we also want a little bit of a break, and then if Lina comes back, she can share her last thoughts. So I want to already thank all three of our panelists today. Hopefully you've been our inaugural panelists. We'd like to continue this conversation. This is very much an effort to build community, not just in these AI spaces, but definitely across different actors, different communities, and for us to better understand how we do our work, how we can contribute to struggles, to ecosystemic struggles, whether it's in understanding issues related to AI itself as a technology, as an industry, but also how AI practitioners, developers, scholars can help. So thank you for inspiring us moving forward. We hope to see you again. So like a big round of applause for our speakers. And yeah, Lina is not back, unfortunately, so we'll thank her offline later. For now, we are moving into a short break. If you could please be back here at 4:30, so we have 13 minutes, so like a quick break, maybe grab a quick coffee and come back directly, because we have another speaker coming in through Zoom. So we'll see you back at 4:30.
trying. Okay. Can you see it?
Yeah. Maybe on full screen, can you put it like?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So thank you very much for coming back again. I'm very excited to present our next keynote speaker. She is Paola Ricaurte. She's an associate professor in the Department of Media and Digital Culture at the Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico, and a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Paola, together with me, Couldry, and Ulises Mejias, co-founded Tierra Comu, a network to promote reflection on data colonialism from the Global South. She is a member of the Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms and the Feminist Artificial Intelligence Research Network. Her work focuses on the critical study of digital technologies from a decolonial and feminist perspective. Her research seeks to impact the development and policies and technologies by critically analyzing the implications of current ethical, economic, and political frameworks. She is interested in broadening the discussion about the social dimension of technology, its relationship to the environment, cultural diversity, and the plurality of knowledge. So, Paola, the floor is yours, and we are very excited to hosting you here today in the workshop. We cannot hear you. I don't know if you're talking.
You're muted.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Paola. Can you mute her?
Apologies. My computer was not responding. Well, apologies and good afternoon, good morning. I'm very excited to be here, and I really appreciate the space to speak about these issues. I think the work that you are doing, opening this workshop and these discussions, is very relevant for the current moment. So I always get very nervous when I speak in English, so I hope you will be patient with me. So first of all, I would like to say that I'm working on trying to promote an integral vision or approach to the ecological impacts of AI. And I will begin quoting the linguist and activist from the Meji community, Yasnaya Aguilar. She is from a community in Mexico. And she begins, well, she has a very interesting proposal. She speaks about a different way of building our technologies. And she begins the text with this idea. And she says, it is a myth of the West choosing perpetual economic growth, advancing through a digestive system of sorts, one that uses technology as one of its core components. In its turn, ecosystem became goods, people, mere consumers. The myth turned the world into a place increasingly inhospitable to human life. So I'm beginning with this because I always try to connect the historical process of extractivism with the current process that we are facing through the development of technological systems, especially with the AI. So to begin with, I will quote this phrase, we are living in an extractive era, but this extractivist logic is linked to colonialism, capitalism, and other configurations of modernity. and its various modes of violence that are associated with different spheres. But for those of us that are the product of the colonial process, we understand the colony as the beginning of the contemporary extractivist process in our territories. And this extractivist process is part of the problems that we have to understand the current technological development as well. So at the beginning, the colonizers used racial superiority to legitimize land and labor exploitation. But this racial superiority is linked to an epistemic dominance. So in this way, the colonial process was also the beginning of the epistemic imposition of the West into these territories. So the so-called globalization as a narrative of the universal character of modernity drove extractivism at scale. And here I think that it's important to understand the role of narratives and also the role of these global forces to build this idea of a universal history. So we all know that development, or the idea of development, is associated with consumption and economic growth. But this is the first or the most important myth that we have to dismantle. So here we have the wealth map of the world. We know that there is a big inequality, and there are rich countries, so-called rich countries, and there are poor countries. But for me, this is one of the narratives that contributes to this reproduction of inequalities. We have rich countries that concentrate wealth, and we have poor countries that provide the resources for this wealth. And this process, as I said at the beginning, is a historical process. But we try to eliminate those narratives. We try to erase those narratives and those historical continuities of extractivism and dispossession. So we can change the narrative, and we can say who are the most the countries that are most responsible for the current environmental crisis. And most of the reports that Oxfam has developed during the past years are showing that there is also a disparity between those countries that are producing the most carbon emissions that is related to this economic wealth. So the carbon emissions of the richest 1% are more than double those of the poorest half of the world. So there is I think that we need to differentiate the responsibilities of the current environmental crisis. And one of these problems is, of course, the way of these narratives about the way that we need, the world that we need to live, and the future that we are trying to achieve. So if we change the narrative and we use this map to see which are the countries that have the most carbon emissions, then we also can understand that those who are rich with this model of consumption, unlimited consumption and production, are most responsible for the climate crisis. So in late capitalism, which is always reconfiguring and reinventing itself, has expanded the frontiers of extractivism, making it a more complex and generalized process. And this is, of course, related to technological development as well. So then we have another narrative. We all think that, or at least this is what we are told, that digital economy is good for us, that we are going to achieve progress and we are going to live better with the development of these digital services. But if we again see the map of how some regions are concentrating the wealth produced by this economy, again, we can see that this economy is only benefiting a very small group of countries and also companies. So in this diagram, well, provided by the UN, it's clear that this gap between the underconnected and the hyper-digitalized countries will widen and worsen inequalities if unaddressed. So in Latin America, we are very heavy, strong users of digital technologies, despite the cost, because it's very expensive to be connected, and also the devices are very expensive. But nevertheless, we are a group of people, a group of population that is contributing to this digital economy with a lot of data. But as you can see in this diagram, we are not there. This means that we don't receive anything from being part of this process or this economy. And we again are reproducing this extractive process, but now with data. So we provide data and we don't receive anything to our societies. The last Oxfam report about inequality, it's also very interesting because during the pandemic, the wealth of the 10 richest men was doubled. And it's interesting because this wealth is mainly associated with technological services, with digital services, and also these 10 men that we all know who they are. These are also 10 white men. So again, in this experience with the pandemic, the richest men associated with technological services are getting even richer, or got even richer. So the incomes of the 99% of the humanity are worse off because of the pandemic. But again, these 10 men got doubled their fortunes. So the researcher, the Chilean researcher Paz Peña, speaks about the ecological products of the digital economy, because we know these narratives about the good sides of technological development, how can technology improve our lives. But at the same time, the increased use of technology and also the problems that we have not solved yet, like, for example, that we don't have any device that is sustainable, that we don't have universal laws for the right to repair, for example, and also that all technological dumps are located out of the West. It's a very problematic issue, because the thing is that some people and some territories, specific territories and peoples, are paying the cost of this technological development. So who is paying the cost of this development? With, for example, territorial occupation, water, land, air pollution, displacement of communities, labor exploitation, poor health or poor living conditions, or death. And the answer is simple. Part of the narratives that this model is constructing, is building, try to disconnect the cost of this technological development with the territories and the bodies that are being dispossessed or exploited, or in this case, taken from their places to contribute to this economy. And this model, which is based in this unlimited consumption and maximization of profit, is related to all to the complete AI life cycle. And that is one of the things that worries me when I see that people are trying to address the ecological problem of AI only in one of the dimensions of the AI life cycle. If we want to address, like in the complexity of the problem, the impacts of the negative impacts of AI and in general technological development, because AI needs devices, because AI needs mineral extraction, because AI needs water and energy, then we need to see the whole picture. And we have to answer the question, who is paying the cost? Who is paying the cost of mineral extraction, of unfair labor, of opaque supply chain, of the cost of transport, of MLM training, of cooling data centers or using data centers, and also tech disposal, the technological dumps. And for me, the view that we need to promote is a view that considers the historical process of extractivism and dispossession, and also as a view to the future, in the sense that we are, of course, now producing technology and using AI and in almost everything that we do today. But if we look to the future, what are going to be the long-term effects of the current AI development? And for me, the way to approach this is to connect the macro-political world, this geopolitics of AI, with the micro-political impacts and the impacts, and also the effects that may not be very visible and that are not necessarily connected to the environmental impacts. But if we consider that we as users of AI, that we as citizens of the world, or laborers, or just common people that are using with these technologies, we also need to consider that we are part of the problem. So we are captured also, our subjectivities are captured by these narratives and by these models. And we think that we cannot live with AI. That's part of the narratives, that there is no world outside of AI or the current AI development. We cannot imagine ourselves without devices, for example. We cannot imagine our relationships without this technological mediation, these algorithmic mediations. So the construction of the self, the construction of our interactions and the views of the world are also part of this big narrative, because we, as part of this system, we contribute or reproduce these narratives through our own daily practices. So the impacts of AI in the production of subjectivities in the bodies and the territories should be connected with the institutional also arrangements that reproduce the idea of having automated processes to solve social problems, and also reproduce the idea of having one type of world, a universal history, or one way to live in the world that should be shared by all of us. So if we want to address again the environmental crisis, we need to connect those dimensions as transversal, and also the short, the medium, and the long-term effects on the bodies and the territories, especially those of the global south, because the poor countries, as I said, and as I showed the data, are paying the cost of this development. So for Yesnaya Aguilar, again, technologies should be understood as techiologies. Techio is a practice, is a shared practice to achieve a common good in a community. It's a practice that is it's not only like present in communities in Mexico, but in all Latin America with different names. And this practice of the techio, to achieve common goals and to do things together, for her is the way to address this environmental crisis. If we want to address a different way of thinking and imagining technologies. So she says we need technology as a techio, and we need to think of technology also as an open source software, in the sense that during the techio, all the community knows everything and shares the basic knowledge to do things together. So in this sense, she says that we all need to participate in the construction of our lives, resisting genocide and extinction. She's one of the most visible voices and people who are telling the state that, of course, the process of genocide of the indigenous communities is an ongoing process. So she says, in the face of our current global climate emergency, we need to foster forms of technological development that emphasize living with dignity and not infinite economic growth as an end in itself. So we must focus on technologies based on collaborative labor more than on competition. And she says, as peoples of Abya Yala, we're experienced in this strategy, which I call techiology. So if the world were to listen to the people of Abya Yala and adopt this new techiological vision, we could perhaps escape the digestive system that so threatens our world's climate and endangers human life. So for the communities in Latin America and the Caribbean who are defending the land and the territories from the process of extraction, the only way to address the ecological crisis is to understand that we are connected to the land, that the people cannot be thought out of the interconnectedness with others and, of course, with the territory. And for me, when we speak about AI and the ecological crisis, we need to consider not only the small technical fixes that can improve, for example, energy consumption or water usage, but also we need to understand that in the current version of hegemonic AI or the dominant AI is just contributing to these asymmetries in terms of economic power, but also in epistemic power, and also in the impacts of in negative impacts on the environment. The current AI, the hegemonic AI, is contributing to accumulate wealth for these 10 or 20 companies or men or white men around the world. So at the end, even if we think that we can change, we can tweak some things with the current AI system, we still need to understand that at the end, those who are benefiting from these hegemonic AIs are these 10 or 12 corporations or people or countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paola, for this super inspiring talk. I'm gonna let the public here in the room to raise your hands if they have like any questions to Paola. Or people on the chat. Well, given that nobody's raising their hand, I do have a question about your recent work where you analyze like the colonial perspective of AI. I really, as I told you before, I really enjoy reading that work, and it's connected with just like the things that you have explained today about like the colonial aspect of AI. So my question is like, so you say that there are like 3 epistemic processes, which is like classification, algorithmization, and automation. And then my question is like, do you have any, given that you also like are a co-founder of this Tierra Comu organization, do you have any specific example to showcase how global violence is perpetuated through this technology and through these 3 epistemic processes?
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, I recently published a paper about AI and violence at scale, because as I said before, I think hegemonic AI is well, I didn't say it actually, but it's a necropolitical machine, because it's contributing to reproduce this systemic violence in different ways. And the ways that that I understand epistemic violence is operating through AI are these 3 connected processes of datafication, that is converting our lives and our environment into data that will be processed by an algorithmic mediation. And then we will be incorporated by the states, especially, and also by corporations, but the states, to control our social lives. So in Latin America, for example, national states are using AI technologies that are bought to the big companies from the north. And these technologies, as also the researchers from Colin Wrights and Joana Barón and Paz Peña say, these technologies that are bought to these companies from the north, and they are very costly, but they are used in our countries to automate neoliberal policies and also to surveil the poor. So if we think of AI, like as I said, of this in this geopolitical dimension, in which only a few companies or a few states are controlling, producing, and selling AI to other countries. These other countries, in this case from the global south, are using those technologies, again, to maintain that asymmetry within their own populations. So the same asymmetries that we see from this industrialized country, the same asymmetries and the same system of domination between those who own the technologies and those who are using technology is reproduced within the nation states, but again, to maintain the poor under control. And this can also be seen in different scenarios. As I said, we have been using these technologies in Latin America in this way, but in industrialized countries, these companies, these big companies, and of course we all know which companies are they, these are used, for example, to control immigrants or refugees. So the same, this violence, which is epistemic because in first place, we're collecting data, we are analyzing this data, we are getting knowledge from this data, and we are using it to automate these policies or these surveillance states. This process translates into economic violence or physical violence or gender violence. So for me, the thing is that we need to consider that AI as this necro-technopolitical machine is a way to govern life and death. And this process of governing life and death is associated with these epistemic operations, but that in turn translate into actual physical death of people, and also other types of violence, like the epistemicide, which is the eradication of knowledge, of the diversity of knowledge and cultures, for example. So, yeah, I was trying to explain a little bit about the argument of the paper, but I would be very interested in hearing your opinions about this idea.
Yeah, it remembers me to this case that Paz Peña announced like a few years ago about a project in Argentina where the government wanted to implement a model to predict teenager pregnancy. And I think it was developed by one of the big company, one of these big tech companies that starts with M. And then I remember that at that time, I looked at the GitHub repository, and they have like the code publicly available, so you could like deep dive into like the model. And it was like a bit outrageous because they wanted to basically target teenagers in order to say, okay, what are going to be what are the factors that make these teenagers get pregnant? Like, why the focus is on the women? Like, why the focus is on the female? Why you don't focus on who get like these teenagers pregnant? Because, you know, when you're pregnant, it's not just an individual decision. It's like a thing of two, a matter of two. So, and yeah, I remember like me when I asked this case, like, this is an example, a clear example, an outrageous example of how AI perpetuates this violence, right? In this case, this patriarchal violence. I don't know if you have any question here in the room. I don't see any question on the chat. Do I have room for another question? Because I have more questions. Yeah, we have a question in the. Do you want to come here so she can
Yeah.
listen to you? And she also can see you. Talk to the computer.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. That was very interesting. So it seems like it's very clear there's a big problem with sort of how the benefits of technological innovation is distributed among certain demographics, where especially one demographic is, overrepresented heavily. So I was wondering what kind of initiatives are currently being developed to redistribute the benefits of technological advancement more fairly. You touched a bit upon it with sort of open sourcing or having a more open source, mindset around technology. But if you're working on anything, or if you know of any interesting examples, that'd be very nice.
Thank you. Great question.
Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, well, I think that these technologies, which, as I said, are owned by a few companies and states in the world, I think we are not getting, or let's say, of course, we are getting benefits in terms of the daily use of these technologies, but this is not a distributed wealth. So I think we're not getting any benefits, like real benefits, because we are increasing our dependence with the technology. We are increasing our we are getting even more poor as countries because of this dependence. But there are initiatives in different countries and in different communities around the world that are trying to develop technologies with a different model. And as Yasnaya says, these are mainly community technologies. These are technologies that are not putting profit like in the center, but are trying to develop technologies with community values. For example, there is a project that I always mention because I think it's a very interesting project from a Maori community in New Zealand. And this community is an NLP, but it's not only the technology itself, like the tool, but they also develop their own licenses, their own community licenses. Of course, this technology it's used for the Maori language, but again, the licenses are not licenses that are coming from outside. These are not licenses developed by someone else. These licenses were developed by the community, and they decided, for example, how their data should be used, who can use their data, and for what purposes. So this type of technologies that are developed within a different framework, I think are an example of the way in which we can have technologies that are not technologies based on the death, basically. So for me, the way to understand a different technological development, and in this case, AI, is considering that we need to understand all the harms in all the AI, as I said, the AI life cycle, but also considering that AI is part of this big or macro geopolitical system in which AI is serving to increase the wealth of a very few actors. So I would say, for me, that's an example. There are other examples, but they share this idea of having not only the decision about the technology, but also the opportunity to experiment their own technology, the technologies that every community needs. Because now the dominant narrative is that we all need AI for everything. And part of the questions are part of the questions that these communities are asking is, do we really need this AI, or do we really need technology, the technology that you are selling us? Do we need to be connected? Do we need to give you our data to exist? So those are, for me, the basic questions. Can we think of a world when people can live in their diversity, or the diversity of their beings, without imposing only one way to exist in the world, which could be being connected, giving our data, or using AI? And I think that's one of the main questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It remembers me to this design justice principle of nothing about us without us, right? Do not develop an AI if you don't take into account what are like our opinions about this technology and about how are you gonna use our data to build your models. That is gonna make you like more profits. Gonna, the revenue is gonna end up in your hands, not in my hands. Do we have more questions? Cool.
Yeah.
Come to the stage.
Hi, Paola. Thank you very much for all your wisdom. You very powerfully pointed out the history of the climate change problem and how and the history of extraction in colonies. And since we are sort of building this new community around figuring out how to think about, how to address, how to engage around ecosystemic challenges in AI, being still located here on the global north, and still being very much, all of us being very much shaped, right, by our cultures, by our histories. Of course, we're taking away that we need to delve more into this history. You already mentioned that. But I think many of us might feel like, oh, what can I actually do apart from, like, say, not using a particular kind of technology, and sort of maybe looking at solidarities, like what are the kinds of solidarities that we can build, or maybe examples that you've seen or that you are part of, where you have people from, let's say, the richer countries, right? But also more broadly, coming together to address the kinds of issues that you've centered today. So where do we start, right? Maybe your PhD students excited about AI, or sort of starting to critique it and wanting to do something, like without, again, imposing our other kinds of solutions. How do we spend our time?
Thank you very much for this question. At the end of the paper, I speak about what are the things that we need to do, and there is this very strong idea of solidarity, and I think solidarity is okay between those who are equal. Then you can speak about solidarity. But if you have people that are unequal, then you have to speak about responsibility, and that's the difference. So citizens of industrialized countries have the responsibility to demand to their governments to stop these processes of extraction, and to promote laws and policies that can benefit the rest of the world. For example, now that in Europe, there's going to be this policy of having only one type of connectors for these computer devices or whatever. This is a very small change. But at the same time, as I was saying, we don't have a single ecological device. Why don't we ask our governments, especially governments of industrial countries, because they are those who can impact technological development, because the technological development is mainly controlled by rich countries. They can also ask for transparency of supply chains, for example. They can also push for stronger laws for just labor. So if we connect all the dots, we can speak about the co-responsibility that we have as people living in this planet, and assume our shared responsibility in this issue. So we can do lots of things, like reducing our consumption, not promoting not promoting technologies that are based on labor exploitation or that are contributing to this violence at scale, as I said. If we can demand our governments and we can organize ourselves to promote these legislations, these policies, we can, of course, impact the whole world, because the decisions are taken about technology are taken in the North. That's a fact. And of course, people in the global South are fighting every day for their lives, and every day land defenders are killed because they are protesting against these mining companies or these transnational companies that are, of course, extracting the resources from their territories. So I think we all need work to do, and we can do a lot of work, of course, and this is going to be different depending in the place of the world or the position of privilege that you have. People that are in the academy can also provide a critical approach to these processes, can provide tools to understand what's happening. And as I said, for me, it's important to understand that we all understand that if we have any technological development, it's because someone is paying the cost. So we have to connect again the production with the cost of that production. So I would say I would love to have solidarity, but I would also love to have responsibility of every actor.
Thank you. That's crystal clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I don't know if we have questions for do we have time for one? No? Okay. So thank you very much, Paola. We don't want to take more of your time. It was like a pleasure to have you here. And yeah, I hope that we're in touch in the future. And yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you, Anna, and with that, also thank you so much for everyone joining us virtually. We are really glad to continue this discussion with everyone in person and virtually, and looking forward to engaging more. And now we'll switch gears a bit. So just for our last final minutes here in person, we wanted to bring back to our discussion
Share that screen.
this, sorry. So, yeah, so we have just a few reflection questions for us in person here. And it's really open discussion now in thinking about what new connections did you make and might have come up as you were hearing from our speakers and during the workshop, or like coming back to the interactive activity earlier in the workshop. and how might your work and research evolve based on this discussion, and what new questions came up. If anyone wants to share.
Yeah, maybe what we could do is to go to Simona first, to ask the question to Simona, because she's like I said, Simona is no, that's okay. I think it's nice to start with her, because she's a policy advisor, one of the people working in the core team of Kim Spartak, who's a member of the European Parliament, who's also responsible for dealing with the new AI Act, but also very much engaged on the other policies and regulations. So maybe it might be nice also for you to respond a little. I don't know if Paola's still able to stay, but in either case to also respond to what you've heard also in the panel discussion, and what sort of the answers on these sort of reflective questions for you. And then we can sort of start a circle and go through the room and see what other people want to add.
Thank you. Well, yes, I'm working on the AI Act in the European Parliament, and it's been super interesting to hear all these broader perceptions and analyses of the whole ecosystems behind these AI systems. And as we briefly touched upon in the previous panel, something I hear a lot is, well, the AI systems being used basically to delay concrete action, seen as such a solution and a tech fix that, well, even today, for example, we have a nitrogen scandal in the Netherlands, and we hear parties say, we're going to solve this not by taking action and by diminishing the nitrogen problem. No, they say, no, we're not going to take action. We need innovation as the solution. So we see broader than only the tech policy field, it's now broadening to the entire climate problem and, well, climate justice. It's just pushed forward as a solution rather than and an excuse to delay real action rather than well, as part of the problem, because that's also something we see at a European level. We're working a lot on, well, trying to reconcile the digital and green transitions, because we hear a lot about how we should be innovative and the digital transition is our priority, and at the same time Europe is aiming for a historic Green Deal. But when you ask how we're going to make the digital transition sustainable, and for example, whether we're going to set rules for data centers, you get looks that say, but data centers won't be necessary in 2050 because we'll have edge nodes. So they're going to innovate ourselves out of it. We don't need rules. So yes, I found it very interesting to hear today a bit more about all the real impacts that you see and how these, well, developments are really part of a system that we can't ignore. And well, things we've been working on concretely for AI is, they sound like low-hanging fruits, but also solutions that I'm actually glad I've heard today a bit more from the various panelists, because it means that I've been listening to clever people like you. But some low-hanging fruits that we've tabled as a part of the solution are more transparency. So we need, well, more information on what is happening. I also heard a lot about greenwashing by companies, and especially large tech companies. So this is something we need more information on. What is the environmental impact of an AI system? We keep hearing, oh, there's no possible way of calculating that because AI is something so innovative and magical, but we think there are quite some ways, and I think there are some researchers such as Roel who know there are quite some ways to estimate at least the impact of some systems. And then once we know a bit more, and even, I mean, if we don't know a bit more, we should be able to set clear standards, because, for example, now we're drafting an entire AI Act, and here again you see the whole, it's based on a product safety model, the AI Act, so not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily take into account the governance systems, the impacts on people. No, it's more, here's an AI system, here's a list of criteria it has to meet, and then it can be placed on the market and it's safe to use. And then the criteria are data logging, bias-free data, And it's really this kind of idea that if you tick some boxes, then you can unlimitedly use AI, but there's no attention to the whole structures around it, the governance systems, but also the structures that we just heard about in the building of a system, the environmental impacts. And that's also why the Greens in the Parliament have been for longer asking for a life cycle assessment of digital technologies. And this is something we're also pushing for in different legislation against greenwashing, against sustainable products initiative, eco-design, these kind of things. And also in that sense, this is also one of our main priorities for the AI Act, to basically take that product safety model and look into the structures around it a bit more. For example, fundamental rights impact assessments before you use an AI system that's deployed in an area that is risky to fundamental rights, or to look how it's used in power imbalances, and to give people rights to complain, rights to file complaints with supervisors. This has all been left out in the regulation as it is at the moment. So yes, I'd like to thank you all for today, and interested to hear the other perspectives, because the more good input we have, the better all the time.
Yeah, thank you. I think you have a very important job to do, right? We do see that Europe can have an impact beyond Europe itself, right? So I think the concerns that Paola has surfaced today as well are, and for instance, looking at different kinds of algorithmic harm and help and violence, algorithmic violence at scale. I think these might be really important sort of facts that we have been collecting over the last years that can also give politicians a different perspective, and to sort of see how what are the kinds of standards, what are the kinds of conditions that could really help to get transparency and to sort of get more, eventually more grip on preventing such harms, not just in Europe, but beyond. I think that's a really important conversation, not just policy, but also I think for our scholars to see how we can help eliminate that. So, well, I think we'll be in touch. I'm going to give the word now to the room. Shall we go in a circle and maybe say a few things, or people want to raise their hands? Is it okay for people to say a few words, just as a matter of shared reflection? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Would you want to go first?
Sure. For me, I think it was very interesting to see the connections and what happens in the back of the AI. And for my research, I think it's an education, AI in education. So then I'm going to question more about whether we need AI. What is the adversarial impacts of AI, and how it affects the ecosystem more broadly. So I think those are my main points. I'm not sure how we're going in this.
Yeah, I can go. I think for me, this has been a very interesting session, of course, and because I've been focusing on the last 2 years on bringing some of these topics to education, my main thought is how do we bring these topics more into computer science programs, into all of these technical programs, so that all the engineers of the future don't leave these topics behind. So that's something that I will continue thinking about after this session.
Thank you.
I think that after that session, I have like 2 takeaways. The first one, it was after Tega's talk and her reflection on systemic and ecosystem, and that brings me like the thought of, should we change the name, the title of the workshop, because maybe it's like how we frame these ecosystemic challenges is too Western, I don't know. And then the second one for me, and it's related to the question you asked to Paola now, It's how we can work here, right, in Europe. And I think that for me, one of the questions, one of the answers, and one of the solutions that it has worked is watch the watchers. So given that now here, people in the room, we have like the tools, we know how to implement AI. We can implement AI to survey the power and use this technology to challenge it.
Becky, any more thoughts from your end?
I would just say I'm really grateful to have been part of this discussion, and I'm curious to see where it goes. But as you know, as for our research, I already mentioned we have a report coming out
yes,
soon.
Looking forward.
But we also want to find a way to stay engaged on these issues beyond the report. So I'll be really curious to hear where this goes. Yeah.
Okay, so I really enjoyed in the group session the fact that the assessment as a whole was very holistic, with the fact that with ecosystemic challenges, to open the mind only goes to issues such as carbon footprint, but instead there is a whole evaluation of the social background of the ties that connect people, and also the last intervention was especially interesting with what concerns the idea of AI assessment from for example, from the AI Act as a sort of checklist that is, however, blind to the context, and that's why I think that an area that will need further investigation, further studies is that of ethical foresight analysis, which is still not that much discussed, I think. And also recognizing the risks that the most common model of impact assessment, there is in fact this checklist, most often self-assessments also, it can breed complacency, saying, okay, it was low risk, so it can go. So yeah, I was definitely a fan of the holistic approach that we explored today.
Thank you. And we have another guest, Eliza, you joined us a bit later this afternoon. Would you want to briefly introduce yourself and just share anything you want? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I work with Amazon Employees for Climate Justice, which is a climate, employee climate group in the States working to hold Amazon accountable on its climate goals. And what we have learned, obviously, it sounds like you guys have talked about, companies like Amazon do a lot of greenwashing. And so even when you do have groups like sustainability groups or ethics groups within the company, they are their goals and motivations are not always in line with what the best outcome is. It's a lot of it is still has to be driven by profit. And so what I learned today, techiology is a new term, and I'm interested in how that concept can be applied with the existing tech companies, because regulation is important, and how do you use regulation to have companies consider community impact in the communities that they're operating, without that also being co-opted, because we've seen that happen too. For example, when Amazon in the States goes to build warehouses in predominantly lower income and communities of color, they say they're bringing jobs, but those jobs, as we know, are not good jobs, and they take a lot of tax money out of the community. And then they say, oh, we're working, literally this has happened. Oh, we are donating $10,000 to the local library for a children's program. That's the community accountability. So how do you actually build that into regulation beyond what, and not have it get co-opted like that?
Thank you.
Yeah. So I don't normally do work in this area, so it's always interesting to know that and see what people work on. And I think one thing that I've been thinking a bit about already is this notion of extractionism. I've really heard of it before. And to me, it seems like what is really wrong with extractionism is the people that do the extraction and not necessarily, the activity itself. So as it's done right now, it's 5 global companies that really profit of extracting insights and value from data. And I thought, Paola's consideration and insight on how to make it a bit more community-driven, how to extract value from data, make it a bit more sort of democratic, was interesting. I think that'd be a nice way to go forward. Democratizing a bit the benefits of technological innovation.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, for me the same as Anna. Like I'm a system engineer or trained as a system engineer, that you don't always need to think of things as systems. And that brings me to like a more higher over point that like, okay, this was about the challenges, but I think we still lack a language or an approach to really like analyze these challenges. So we see them here and there, and we use some languages from other disciplines, but I think it's also there's a need to like create this common language or approach to really investigate those challenges.
Yeah. I was thinking something along similar lines. Particularly in Paola's response to your question about what should we do. It seemed that her response was that we should protest and call on our governments to somehow, I think, like to somehow address historical issues of colonialism that we have inherited and have contributed to the state that we're in. But that seems like a really big jump from like what the problems are and what the solutions are. So I think I agree with Sam that we need to continue having these conversations and find more translational vocabularies with which we can try to find solutions that are actionable at different levels, not just at the level of citizens calling on policymakers, but also policymakers being proactive, technical development people thinking about these issues in the work that they do and bringing up those issues in the hierarchies that they work in, and also creating space for perspectives like Paola's in venues like Hybrid Human Artificial Intelligence Conference, which are sort of dialogues that don't happen that frequently. So yeah, so I think this workshop is a great initiative, because I don't know of any workshop that explicitly targets such a big issue like systemic issues and ecological issues. They're already two huge things. I think there's a lot to parse.
Yeah, I find it very inspiring. I'm also not usually in the field, and I'm quite skeptical of the solutionism that exists in the field that I'm in, which is like NLP and social robots. And I think I really liked that a lot of the presentations gave me ideas for questions to ask, and like in an environment that isn't like this one, right? Like if I bring something up, like should we do this if we like build a robot for an elderly home? Do they really need that? Do they want that? And I think I'm probably going to ask you for your presentation at some point, because I really, but it did really help me to like conceptualize some of the things and then be more specific about the questions that I do want to ask those people, because I do lack a lot of the vocabulary or depth on how to approach it. And I think this was really helpful in that, and how to bring it into communities that are not as open to it, because they're very enthusiastic about solving things with AI, which isn't a necessarily bad thing, but I think their enthusiasm blinds them to some of the risks. And I think that using the right language can be really helpful to get them on the side and to get them to think about it. And I found that very inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anna, did you share actually?
It's your turn.
Okay, so I guess I'm the last one. But for me, thank you so much, everyone. I think for me, what came up was that hopefully this socio-ecological technical systems approach could help in creating this new kind of shared language, and hopefully situating algorithmic systems within this socio-ecological technical systems context, where it could help bring in more diverse voices and especially like I feel very strongly about like how do we better engage like civil society and to broaden the conversation across so many different fields and practice. And as workshop organizers, we've been very engaged in this field for the past more than a year, and really excited to continue this discussion and engage together and like making it more applied and practical, as you mentioned as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I'll add just one more thing, because I think for me, yeah, so what this really reminded me of is like how important it is to be humble, right? Like humble for these challenges, but at the same time, like humility can also give hope, because we start to sort of reflect on ourselves and learn a lot more, and that gives like an action perspective for me. Like, what do I need to do to learn? And so I think even though these challenges are very big, they are connected, and it's I think really looking at the future or the next event, bringing in issues of positionality, like, so how does our positionality sort of shape how we look at these problems, and how can we combine it? So the sort of lateral collaboration that was mentioned today, the listening that's needed. So there's, I think, a lot of power in I think a community like this to reflect on ourselves and to understand our assumptions. And those are not gone once we've entered this, right? It's an ongoing process. So I'm very excited, because it just gives me at least a lot more, not just humility, but also perspective on how to spend my time. So thank you all very much for being part of this today. I feel again like this. Do you want to wrap it up, Bobby? Or
yeah. Well, I mean, just thank you to the organizers as well. I feel like
quite a journey the last couple of months, and it's been fantastic to bring the four of us together. And I want to do a special thanks for Bobby, who's been really the driving force. Without you, we wouldn't have had this event today. So thank you very much for not just all the work you've done, but also all the ideas and all the research that has gone into this. So thank you, Bobby. Thoughts, Maria?
No, just thank you. Yeah, and I was thinking, because we started the workshop by sharing how some of our experiences shaped how we look at the field and at these challenges. And I really hope that we can avoid that in the future, and that we can create that awareness without people having to make the same mistakes, and then those mistakes make them realize and start the journey. So I think hopefully this type of events in this type of conferences and many other types of conferences will be a step in that direction.
Okay, so I think that brings us. Oh, Anna,
No.
It brings us. I also want to thank Simona, who is still online with us, for joining. That was really fun. I think a very great idea to listen to your reflections at the end, also because you have such also fantastic opportunities to take some of the ideas to the battleground in Brussels. That brings us to the.
Thanks everyone joining us online as well. We're really looking forward to continuing the discussion. And thank you everyone.